So welcome everyone. My name is Ken Levenson. I'm the Executive Director of the Passive House Network, formerly known as NAPHN. We're still getting used to the branding transition. And I want to welcome you to PHN Presents. And I'm really excited about the presentation today. We're calling Beneficial Electrification, Connecting Climate Justice and Decarbonization. And our presenters today will be Yuan Tan, an associate at RMI, and Bomee Jung, principal at Topsight Advisors, LLC. I want to just take a minute to introduce the Passive House Network. For those of you who don't know us, we are a national nonprofit. We're really focused on training and education, advocacy with education to all building industry stakeholders, from owners, developers, contractors, architects, engineers, policymakers across the board, and really catering our education to those folks. We have a membership and regional chapters across the country, and we're affiliated with the Passive House Institute in Darmstadt, Germany, and the International Passive House Association. And one of the really key ingredients that we bring to the conversation here is this global network that we so cherish, and the input and expertise that we pull from around the world and bring it to our local conditions, our regional needs. So we encourage everyone who's interested to become a member and be active in the Passive House Network. I want to do a quick shout out, thank you to our sponsors, who we really could not be doing all of this great programming without their support. Across the different aspects of building construction, in terms of components, in terms of services, bringing high quality and a real concern for high performance construction. And I'd like to just make sure that you're aware of some ongoing events from the Passive House Network. So live online, we have a few things happening coming up. Every other Friday, and we'll see how that rolls out, we have a short intro to Passive House presentation online on Fridays at noon on Friday. I give it, and it's a pretty quick run through the Passive House and why it's compelling. And so I encourage anyone that you know who may be interested in Passive House and learning a little bit about it to have them attend. It's free, and we have a nice discussion. December 8th, we're excited to launch a new seminar live online called Passive House Windows. And it's an afternoon on the East Coast from 1 to 5 p.m. And you can register and purchase registration online on our website. It's really great, and windows are really underappreciated in terms of driving performance in Passive House and really allowing designs to have that design freedom. And so we're happy to have this course up and running now. And then our core certified Passive House designer class is going to be back in person once again, the first time since the beginning of the pandemic, starting January 24th. So if you're in the New York City region and itching to do it in person, by all means, register for that course. And then we have a growing group of on-demand courses with the core CPHD course as well. And really what's great about these and getting good feedback is the flexibility that it affords and affordability, frankly. And so it's a really still high quality education in terms of the content. And we hope the pacing that you can find to get through it, get to the exam, pass the exam, and get that great credential. And then the last two announcements here I'd like to make is one in particular for the conference that's coming up. We're super excited to be going to Boston, Massachusetts. The conference will be June 15th to the 17th. And we have a call out for ideas for papers, submissions, presentations, whatever you want to call it, going on right now with a deadline of December 1st. And we're really looking at all the excitement that's happening in New England and Massachusetts in particular, greater Boston area. But of course, as a Passive House Network conference, we will have national content as well as international content. and really looking forward to bringing those connections and everyone learning from each other. It will be a hybrid event, looking to have a great group of people in person in Boston, but it will also be streamed live on the internet. And then finally, I want to give a shout out to an important program that we've developed this year, an education fellowship that's really geared toward increasing Black participation in Passive House and getting more Black certified Passive House designers and consultants and people of color in general. And we're very encouraged by the interest and look forward to working with more folks and diversifying the Passive House industry. So with that, I'm really thrilled to be introducing this presentation. When I first read the report from RMI, I was really excited because so much of what we're seeing around climate action and building is geared toward electrification, and then the conversation goes to net zero and renewable energy production. And we're kind of like in the high performance building world, like, wait, energy efficiency, and what are we doing here? And this report, more than anything I've seen, really distills that down, brings the point home, and makes sure that if we care about equity, if we care about climate justice, the conversation has got to include investment in the building structure itself and delivering healthy, affordable, comfortable, resilient buildings. That electrification and renewable energy on its own is not going to do it. And to the extent that we can go beyond weatherization and make truly resilient buildings, so much the better. So with that, I guess my personal endorsement for what it's worth. I'm really happy we've got an AI credit here, PHI credit, and super thrilled to introduce briefly Yuan Tan, who's an associate at RMI, working in the carbon-free building program. And she has experience in the decarbonization of affordable housing in New York City. Yuan received her Master of Public Administration from Columbia University, focused on energy and environment. And Bomee Jung, principal at Topsight Advisors, LLC, who provides independent strategic advisory services to select building sector organizations, including architecture and engineering firms and climate-focused nonprofits. For over a decade, she has contributed to New York City's climate leadership through policy and programmatic innovations. Bomee holds a master in city planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and serves on the boards of New York Passive House and the Institute for Market Transformation. So it's my great honor to welcome them both here, and I can hand over the slides. Share coming back.
Okay, can we see this?
You're good.
Okay. Well, thanks, Ken, for the brilliant introduction. And thanks everybody for joining us today to hear about our report that was recently published about how we can be decarbonizing homes to support healthier communities, particularly for ones that bear the heaviest economic, social, and environmental burdens. So my name is Yuan. I am an associate with RMI's Carbon Free Buildings team. I particularly work at the intersection of building electrification and its health and air quality implications. I currently explore the co-benefits of whole home retrofit packages, particularly for frontline and environmental justice communities. I support our work both at a state and local level with a focus on New York, and I'm particularly interested in how public and affordable housing programs can lead the housing market to decarbonization. Joining me today is my co-author, Bomee Jung, and I'm going to pass the mic to her to hear about some of her work, the significance of the work that we've done together, why we are asking these questions, and what we hope you may take away from our chat today. Bomee.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Yuan. So I'm Bomee Jung. Nice to, well, actually, we can't see you, but I'll I'll pretend I see you all. I'm particularly pleased to be here because I do consider myself not, a passive house person, even though I'm not a designer. And just in terms of my personal background, I've been working in affordable housing, first at Enterprise Community Partners, working on income regulated affordable housing, and then at the New York City Housing Authority, obviously working on public housing. And so, I've always sort of straddled the space between being a building science advocate and being a housing advocate. And, when Passive House really started to make waves here in New York, the thing that I was really the most excited about was the opportunity to bring together the values that are in the building science side of things and the values that are in the housing side of things in a way that to me made a lot of sense and that I thought was coherent, particularly as a way of building coalitions and pushing policy forward that really helps to improve the quality of buildings overall. And I think that that's really the overall message that I wanted to share through this report is just pointing out that we do have these great overlaps and interests between the building science community and the housing community and folks in the social sector who are pushing for improved housing. And I want to make sure that in all of our enthusiasm for all of the developing technologies and the means and methods stuff, that we don't lose sight of the fact that these are really important issues that land for people, in the grassroots and at home. So, Yuan, do you want to advance the slide, please? So, to that end, what we started out with is this question of, how do we, make the case for maximizing the benefits to communities through this mechanism of improving health, using the home as a way of delivering these benefits, right? So, what we were basically asking in a very broad sense was, are we missing an opportunity here if we talk about things just in environmental terms, in carbon terms, right? Because at the end of the day, whether you're talking about a tent or whether you're talking about a skyscraper, the first the purpose of a building is to create an indoor environment, right? And so let's make sure we look at that as an opportunity. Go ahead. And when you look at where we're starting from, it's not a wonderful picture, right? It's like more than a third of housing in the United States has repairs, that need to be done. And if you look at how that breaks down just in this chart, half of the needed repairs are having to do with uncontrolled mold, uncontrolled bulk water and moisture, and half of the reported repairs have to do with structural repairs. So these are not marginal issues. We're talking about really fundamental problems in our building stock, right? And so we're talking about not just improving a building product that is fundamentally okay. I think that what these numbers tell us is that, by and large, there's a lot that needs to be done, even just to get to a point where we can say, these are acceptable quality buildings, even by the existing standards that we have today. Next. And then when you look at who is occupying the worst of the housing, and of course, it's as you would expect, it's the folks who are least able, to take on the burdens of maintenance and take on the burdens of investing in the housing. And so, it is at the end of the day, fundamentally a structural equity issue. Next. And then add to that just the impact of the fact that, we're obviously still a fossil fuel dependent community in terms of, how we particularly make heat and hot water. Next, which also has community-wide impacts. And so as far as what our key messages are from this report, as Ken so definitely summarized in his blog post, what we're talking about here is the opportunity to develop a holistic package of interventions that are focused on housing quality and that go beyond just carbon impacts, which are obviously super important. It's the challenge of our generation. But let's not forget that when we're talking about housing, we're also talking about, homes for people. And so, when we looked at digging into this question in a sort of an academically rigorous way, what we did was look at, tying back the health benefit research that has already been done around housing quality, of which there's a lot. What we determined is that, at a very high level, summarizing the health research, the reason why the health benefits from improving housing quality accrue more to low-income communities is basically because they are more vulnerable to the impacts that are negative. And so when you take away those negative impacts, then they benefit disproportionately, right? And so this is not a value statement. This is essentially what the health research tells us, and essentially we can take their word as fact, is basically, right? So then we talked a little bit about, well, the state and local governments at the end of the day really have the most leverage over housing quality, right? The building codes are set at a local level. Many of the subsidies around housing are delivered at the local level. And so we thought about, well, what kind of opportunities should local and state governments be ready to take advantage of? Next. So we developed this goal, right, in terms of how do we think about whether electrification policy is truly beneficial for communities generally, and the principle here basically is to say, housing should still meet housing goals first. So it should, we should focus on housing quality. We should focus on whether we're delivering healthful indoor environmental quality, as well as looking at the other impacts that of electrification, namely greenhouse gas impacts, as well as how the functioning of the grid is impacted. And so what we basically did is, we looked at this idea of beneficial electrification as a concept that's coming out of the utility sector, right? So the history of the term beneficial electrification basically is that, it's actually kind of counterintuitive. It was coined at a time when the electricity sector was feeling besieged by messaging from the gas industry that said, because you have such high transmission losses, the efficient fuel to use is in fact on-site gas combustion, because there's less transmission loss. And so the electricity industry was like, wait a minute, there's all kinds of benefits to using electricity, and among them there's productivity. You can't run computers off gas, and so this idea of beneficial electrification came not originally in the sense of there's a baseline and we're going to improve it. It really came from a sense of there are ways, there are uses which are particularly well suited for electricity. And so in this new conversation of beneficial electrification as a carbon mitigation measure, that's been changed really to focus on the carbon impacts, as well as making an aging electric grid, investing in an aging electric grid to make it function better, right? So we're talking about system-wide impacts. And what we're suggesting here is that if you want to borrow this idea of the beneficial electrification from the utility sector, and you want to apply it to buildings, and you want to apply it to housing in particular, then the benefit that we're talking about can't just be environmental. The benefit that we're talking about can't just be about the electric utilities. The benefits that we're talking about really have to be about the core mission of housing and how housing impacts the lives of people, namely through health. Next. So, we don't have to spend a lot of time here. What we mean by a beneficial electrification package, what we're saying is basically build a passive house with no fossil fuel combustion indoors. And that is essentially what the health research suggests, right? So next. And when we were writing this report, we were thinking about, the various audiences that may be interested in speaking with each other, and that would mutually benefit from having more dialogue, more conversations. And so we tried to write this report in ways that get across the message that housing advocates like me would want to get across, at the same time that we are, making supported statements from the health research side, as well as from the building science side of things. And all of that to say, again, to point out the fact that there is this common ground that we share, that we should be occupying through policymaking. Next. So in terms of how the report itself is organized, the first section really looks very closely at the health research. So the first section is really based on literature review of, it's actually a literature review of literature reviews. So we were trying really hard to be as rigorous about getting the right health information as possible. And what we looked at was the research that linked particular interventions that are part of what we defined as this beneficial electrification package. What are the health impacts associated that have been proven out in health research for those particular interventions? There's not a lot of research that looks at the entire package, right? Because we haven't really been doing it that way, and I think it's difficult probably to design those sort of studies. But what we can say is that when you look at the research as a whole, there are some really strong trends. The second part looks at this question of why is it that the vulnerable communities and low-income communities and communities of color are the folks who would really benefit the most by making policy decisions that prioritize beneficial electrification. And then in the third section, we make some suggestions just as a starting place about how local governments may take action on that. So I'm going to, at this point, turn it over back to you, Anne.
Thanks, Bomee. So the mechanisms through which beneficial electrification can deliver health improvements are many. We can see indoor air and environmental quality improvements to safer indoor temperatures during extreme heat and cold, and even increased energy security. And I am now going to take you through each one that we have identified. So the undesirability of introducing combustion-related pollutants into the home has long been acknowledged in health literature, right? Pollutants from fossil fuel combustion are linked to a variety of adverse health impacts. And in the table on the right, we've really tried to demonstrate the extent of these health impacts and that you may see from both a short-term and long-term exposure to these pollutants. Our synthesis of several health and housing interventional studies show that removing fossil fuel burning equipment and appliances in our homes is effective as a pollution source control measure, and doing so would immediately reduce the risk of health harms such as decreased lung function, asthma incidence, brain damage, heart failure, and cardiovascular disease, amongst many others. And so studies have also shown that a combination of both a high performance envelope with compartmentalization and enhanced ventilation has shown positive effects on indoor environmental quality. Well-sealed envelopes and compartmentalization can help reduce pest infestations and the moisture conditions that often lead to mold. It also helps prevent the infiltration of potentially polluted outside air. Additionally, we did some modeling here at RMI and found that high-performance envelopes have the added benefit of providing increased hours of safety, which is the maintenance of safer indoor temperatures during hot or cold weather. So our analysis compared a passive house standard building envelope to a code-compliant new building during a power outage in a cold snap and found that the passive house was able to maintain safe indoor temperatures 4 days longer than the code building. In our exploration, we also document the benefits of adopting all electric equipment and appliances and how this can increase the access to air conditioning and the ability to mitigate the deadly effects of extreme heat events. So high performance envelopes are great and can contribute to more efficient cooling and safer indoor temperatures, but modeling suggests that they also cannot fully mitigate the effects of heat buildup in the absence of AC. So, when overnight temperatures stay high, such as during a heat wave. And RMI's modeling of different cooling technologies during a heat wave this past summer in Seattle found that heat pumps are the most climate aligned cooling technology, while also being superior at maintaining a comfortable and safe indoor air temperature. I think we're also finding that the bonus of adopting all electric equipment and appliances in the home means that we can also cook without open flames, with the use of an electric induction stove. And this helps us avoid heating up our space while cooking, which means that we spend much less effort trying to cool our homes while simultaneously also keeping our energy consumption and costs down. The evidence also strongly suggests that removing in-building combustion can have a positive impact on what goes on outside of our buildings. Combustion equipment in our homes, such as boilers, furnaces, and hot water heaters, are vented to the outside. And so the removal of these will contribute to better outdoor and neighborhood air quality. A recent Harvard study found that roughly 15,000 to 20,000 premature deaths every year are due to outdoor PM 2.5 air pollution, specifically from burning fuels in residential buildings. We will also be reducing the demand on what is an aging, leaky, and risky gas distribution infrastructure. The research that we looked at found that leaking supply lines and equipment in buildings are contributing to fugitive methane levels in cities, with the latest paper looking at urban leaks finding that, at least in Boston, the estimated leak rate is at least 6 times higher than previously estimated. And methane is a lesser known greenhouse gas that can actually have more than 80 times the global warming impact of carbon dioxide. So that's pretty significant. Finally, the combination of electrification and high efficiency, climate appropriate smart technology gives us the opportunity to increase the affordability and reliability of energy access, which is a very important driver of health inequity. The reliability and affordability of energy access has an important impact on health. When households are unable to adequately meet their basic household energy needs, or what is known as energy insecurity, a wide range of health issues can occur, such as stress, mental health, to poor sleep, and cardiovascular and respiratory health. Direct health harms can also occur, such as carbon monoxide poisoning, temperature-related illnesses, and even death, when residents resort to alternative energy sources to meet needs when conventional needs fail them. So in part 2, we identify how communities face disproportionate economic, health, and social burdens, and why we need to center these circumstances as we think about decarbonizing our building stock. So evidence shows that low-income communities repeatedly face stressors on multiple levels, and they experience both heightened vulnerability and exposure in comparison to more affluent populations. Some of the vulnerabilities that we have identified include systemic racism, marginalization, and discrimination, limited access to resources, and the resulting trade-offs, as well as poor neighborhood and household conditions. These communities must also grapple with heightened exposure to location-based pollutants, because of their closer proximity to polluting sources such as power plants, highways, Superfund sites, etc. Climate risks, so exposure to extreme heat, flood zones, and even in-home pollutants and allergens. Health research has indicated that 60% of the burden of heart disease is directly attributable to living in poverty and its associated risks. We're also learning that children under the age of 6 who live in homes that use a gas stove or oven for supplemental heat are 80% more likely to have asthma than children in homes that do not. Summer temperature differences between redlined and non-redlined neighborhoods also can approach up to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. 70% of people living below the poverty line also have significantly higher exposure to surface urban heat than those above the poverty line. So the combination of all these factors and disparities serve as a sort of magnifying glass for any impact, be it good or bad. For example, when the New York City Mayor's Office modeled the health and air quality benefits of electrifying buildings, asthma emergency room visits were reduced by 10 times more in lower income communities than compared to more affluent neighborhoods, even though the reduction in pollution was similar. The fact is, the circumstances that these communities face are immensely different, and we absolutely must take that into account when designing policies. And Bomee is going to walk us through how that may look like.
Yeah, next. So, in talking about the state and local policies, I think just one contextual thing to remember is that when we talk about housing for low-income folks and affordable housing versus like subsidized housing or regulated housing, there are a lot of terms that have to do with how we go about housing low-income communities, and really anybody who basically, right, the definition is if you can't pay the market rent, so people who are having essentially high rent burdens. And a lot of the opportunities that we have in using the formalized affordable housing system, so like our tax credit subsidies, our direct subsidies to buildings, all of those things that are essentially governmental levers as well as standard setting. These are tools that can be applied in affordable housing, but then can have impacts beyond the specific, affordable regulated housing, because the folks who work in construction, for example, on affordable housing are also part of the market that works on multifamily housing, that are market rate housing. And so there's an opportunity to use both subsidies and standard setting to move the entire market along beyond just looking at the opportunity to change standard practice and construction practice in the affordable housing sector itself. And so when we looked at, categorizing the kinds of recommendations that we had for state and local action, we really thought about it along those lines. Things that you can do to accrue benefits to people who are in low-income housing, so designated low-income housing today, things that you can do to move the construction quality standard basically from the bottom up, right? So all people benefit with essentially sort of a quality floor, and then things that you can do to use the affordable housing community to move the construction market as a whole, across an entire city or region. So just to go through the general categories, so we talk about adopting an enabling policy framework that takes into consideration the interests and the agency of low-income communities, right? So it's not just a question of delivering benefits to low-income communities, but also sharing the power to make the decisions about the policies that directly impact low-income communities. We also talked about, again, how to use the existing markets to deliver better housing programs. And then we talked about how to change standards so that you're supporting the entire market and not just a segment of the market. And then we really talked about resources, right? Because at the end of the day, there is no way to have housing that is affordable to the lowest earners in the community without providing resources to do that, right? By definition, affordable housing means that the market need is not being met, right? So people can't pay the market prices. That means that subsidy has to come from somewhere, right? And whether that's a direct subsidy or indirect subsidy, we need those resources. And so part of advocating for housing quality and part of advocating for using using standards like the Passive House standards as a means to ensure housing quality, it also means that you have to go and advocate for the resources to be able to make that work. Next. So just to get into the specific recommendations in each of these categories, just in a very, very high level breezy way, I want to highlight just in the section where we talk about the policies to support the enabling frameworks for housing policy. It's really important to realize that we already have a really a powerful set of allies pretty much in every community in the country. And these are the community development corporations and community-based organizations. So these are organizations that are the frontline organizations when it comes to housing and low-income housing. They often develop affordable housing, they manage affordable housing, and they oftentimes are multi-service agencies that actually do social services as well. So these are really frontline organizations. And if you, for example, are our service provider, you're an architect or an engineering firm, and you're asking yourself, well, how do I get closer to understanding how to serve frontline communities? I would really encourage you to go look around and say, well, who are the CDCs that are serving the areas where I want to work, right? And go make friends with them, right? Because those are frontline organizations. They are highly capable frontline organizations. They navigate a tremendous amount of process because they're often government funded, and they're truly experts in the areas in which they work, right? In the second category, thinking about standard setting and regulation, I think that I hope everybody on this call would agree with me. I think it is high time that we ask that all affordable housing, so this is housing that we can directly regulate through policymaking, that all subsidized affordable housing, the new construction buildings be built to a passive house standard, right? Do we need to say more? This is something that I think has sort of happened in New York City to a great degree, not because there's been a specific you must build passive house mandate, but because the system that we set up for the competition around the housing subsidy already has a mechanism for ratcheting up your ambition on housing quality and on green construction as a proxy for housing quality. And so when you look at the awards that are getting made at the City of New York, for example, we have a lot of passive house multifamily buildings because we made this effort to use that as a policy lever to do that. Next. Oh, it changed. So then the other two categories, so in looking at the local, using codes and standards, one issue that we have in New York City in particular is that we recognize the danger that high heat represents, as I was talking about earlier, but we don't actually have a sort of a health and safety standard around that. In the same way that we have a health and safety standard around minimum temperatures during the heating season, we should probably have some kind of a safety standard around the maximum indoor temperature during the air conditioning season, right? This is something that I think that would be if you're in a community where you've already crossed the threshold of setting that kind of a health and safety threshold, I'm not sure why we didn't recognize the changing science on this and say, well, we need to add, we need to protect people from morbidity and mortality related to high heat. The other one that I'd like to highlight in the last category, the advocating for resources, is simply that, when I say advocate for resources, I don't just mean go ask for more money, right? Although please go ask more money because, the reconciliation. But, having said that, there's also just a lot of resources that are tied up in ways that could be really helpfully unleashed if only we could change some of the rules, right? So getting resources isn't always about getting a pot of money. Sometimes it's just being able to say things like, well, I already have this pot of money and I have this other pot of money, and the rules are such that I can't use them together, right? We see that's something that we actually see relatively frequently. And when we run into these things, we should really try and form whatever national coalitions that we need to be able to, or find the national coalitions that we need to find to get those rules changed. Because every time that kind of thing happens, you're talking about opportunity wasted, and the meaning behind that wasted opportunity is simply time, right? We all know as passive house folks, right, that the work that we do today is more impactful in terms of carbon mitigation than the work that we do next month or next year or the year after. Speed is really an issue here, and we don't want things that are slowing work down for reasons that are at this point may have made sense in the past but should really not be the priority today. So we want to loosen up these regulations that are keeping people from being able to marry these pots of funds. Next. Back to you, Yuan. Oh, that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bomee. Thank you, Yuan. Terrific presentation. So we want to have a little bit of a discussion here about the report, about your presentation. And if folks want to throw further questions into the chat, certainly welcome it. I will try to keep an eye on that. For sure. You know, there's so much here and so much kind of fundamental in terms of how we can improve our basic living conditions, how we can improve our building stock and build a better future for everyone. I'm wondering, you know, kind of where the rubber hits the road and is in the opportunities and getting in early enough. Like we were talking before about Ithaca, New York is just declaring that they're going to electrify every building in the city. And so where does beneficial electrification enter that conversation? And how do we see the opportunities to be able to make sure that we're optimizing these buildings? I'm wondering if you have any thoughts in terms of, you know, connecting the resources, yes, but to the processes and the conversations, and how can we, especially when there's such a range of benefits that we're seeing here, there's got to be lots of groups who have a vested interest in seeing this succeed. I don't know, thought on how we like implement in something like that?
I mean, I'll just share from my perspective again as a housing advocate. You know, when I talk about passive house, you know, to non-passive house folks, usually I'm talking about it as a quality assurance kind of a process, right? I say, well, we know how to build buildings that are much better than what we typically build today. So if you go out and you're doing you know, typical construction, you're actually not building the best building we know how to build using the technologies and materials we have available to us. And what the passive house standards do is it gives you they give you frameworks within which you can say, well, let's actually try to build the best building we know how to build today. So not tomorrow's best building. And we're talking about building today's best building. It's just, I think I talk about things like, you know, the required open wall testing, right? So instrumented testing versus visual inspections. I think that these sorts of things, as sort of maybe borderline nerdy as they may seem, I think these sorts of things make sense to people who deal with buildings and even from a real estate perspective, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's really where I would really love to see the passive house community double down in the language is around, you know, two things. One is this idea that, you know, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we're still trying to figure out. There's a lot of improvements that we're trying to make in both technology and methods, but there's also just the aspect of we kind of already know how to do this. And the power of the tools is in helping the practitioner sort of do the right thing. It's kind of no different in a way than, you know, the tool go on day, like, you know, the what is it, the checklist in the operating room, right? It's that kind of an exercise, right? It's not that the doctor doesn't know how to do the things in the checklist. It's just that it's there to help you make sure that you do it every single time.
Yeah, now, well put. Yuan, any thoughts on tying it in?
I think that, you know, one thing that really stuck out to me as we were, you know, embarking on this research and to your question about like, what can we be doing? I think we also need to be talking more to each other. And I think that we need to be thinking, you know, casting a larger net in terms of thinking of what we are impacting, right? Like our approach has to be more intersectional. And while that might mean that we have to take into account more factors and, you know, like what are some unintended consequences on the health side and energy side, and like, yes, that may be challenging and some may see this as a burden and a challenge, but I want to, you know, perhaps like reframe that and maybe get people to think more about like, this is an opportunity where we can be combining resources, we can be tapping into larger networks, we can be tapping into more expertise, and be more efficient in our approach, in that, if we are doing all of this load in the beginning, we may be able to avoid all of the unintended consequences and scrambling and trying to fix and patch holes in the end, that, we're already doing all the work in the beginning. So I think there needs to be more cross-industry communication, partnerships, however that may look like. I think that we need to be reaching across the aisle a lot more. And I think that will may hinder some things, because we have to take more opinions into account. Maybe that's the flaw of democracy, but I think it can also be a really great thing.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I mean, expanding the conversation, expanding the community of people in the conversation is so important. As difficult as that work can be, at the end of the day, it just makes it so much stronger. And I think, Bomee, what you're saying about the technology today, what we know already, and the struggle that we see in Passive House so often is, folks want to do the minimum that they can get away with, even in terms of, weatherization and improvements to the building, and having that kind of climate resilience. And we're in Passive House, we want to do the best that we can do today, and at the end of the day, have a great building and not do the minimum, but really strive for high quality. And how do we bring that to everybody? One comment from the chat was to speak a little bit about energy security versus microgrids. I think speaking to, I don't know, I interpret that question a little bit in terms of the renewable energy conversation and the resiliency of the grid versus the resiliency of the building, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, we didn't actually get into that very much in the paper, other than just to sort of gesture at it in like a general kind of way. But I think, there's clearly a very strong relationship between minimizing your loads and buying yourself additional flexibility, right? So whether that is for sort of, let's call it protective purposes, in other words, resilient, what we think about it as resiliency purposes, or whether that's for essentially grid efficiency purposes, right? So in other words, like if we're bringing all this load on, right, there's all this conversation, well, what does the grid need to do to be able to support all of that? And I think that either way, we just don't want to allow folks who are outside of the building industry, even when they're value aligned with us, we don't want to allow them to make false assumptions about what we can and can't do with buildings, right? Because I think that if you ask the question, well, why would we, actually, the numbers I actually have escaped me, but like in the report, we have some details about like the magnitude of the investments that are being proposed on the grid side of the ledger, right? And they're huge. They dwarf the housing investments by quite a lot. And so if you look at that, I guess my question would be, are we oversizing the investment on the grid side of things because we don't think that we can make the load minimizing investments in the structures themselves, in the buildings themselves? And why would we make that assumption, right? Particularly when the upgrading the building asset lines up with delivering these kinds of health benefits that are really fundamental to benefiting actual people, right? It's not a hypothetical benefit. It's not a sort of an abstracted systemic benefit. We're talking about actual individual people who are going to do better in their day-to-day lives.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's one of the things, if I could, on top of that, just say, it's one of the things I love about the report is kind of the separation. You have electrification and the building, which the report's really focused on. And then of course there's electrification in the grid and the renewables and the idea of net zero and all of that, which is separate. And it allows us to really dive into having the best buildings possible and the best health outcomes. Because if we have mediocre buildings, that are net zero, they're still going to be problematic in all the ways that you've described here. It's
Yeah,
like
and
people are going to die in net zero buildings.
Well, if I might also just add, right, the whole if you think about the rationale behind the push to electrification as sort of like our first move, right, it really has to do with optionality, right? Because what we're basically saying is, if we move to the electric grid, regardless of what the fuel mix of the generation is today, we know that we can change those things down the road. And so if we make the sticky decision that you have to make today in a way that allows us to have optionality down the road, you're saying exactly the same thing when we say invest in buildings, right? Because what we're saying is invest in the buildings to get the load management and to get the load down so that you have the optionality in the future of potentially, I don't want to say failing in the grid decarbonization, but take some of that risk off the table, right? Just by doing more on the load side of things, and also health benefits.
Right. Great. So Monty, you've been very patient.
Hey, this was
Monty
great.
Paulson.
Hi, I'm Monty Paulson. I'm with RDH Building Science, and I'm in Vancouver, British Columbia, currently cut off from the rest of Canada by climate change. I wanted to echo and kind of reinforce one of the points that you made and maybe raise one more. We've done about 6 billion square feet of passive house buildings, most of it affordable housing, not all of it. And I completely agree and want to just reinforce what Yuan said about needing to reach out and talk to people. We have found not all, but the majority of homeless and nonprofit housing providers are quite conservative. They really don't want a new thing. They view passive house as a threat that's going to take budget away. They want to have the same boiler they've had in the last 3 buildings because it's working for them, and they've had lots of mechanical problems with other systems. And so reaching out early and getting them on board is critical. When we first started and we were a little too keen to get them going, we lost projects. People just didn't want to work with us because we were pushing them into too much technology. And so I think we need to, as we reach out, realize that the way really great, well-intentioned, huge-hearted nonprofit housing providers ruin buildings is by being super conservative. And the way building technologists and building science people ruin buildings is by trying to put in the latest, coolest stuff, and constantly running new building science experiments on these things. And we need to find that midpoint, where we really try to never put in a new heat pump in a nonprofit project we haven't put in 3 or 4 projects before and actually seen it work. We try to never do a ventilation system in a nonprofit project unless we do it in 3 or 4 buildings before and seen it work, and force ourselves to be a bit, to be safe on their behalf, because they don't have a lot of room for operations, and to constantly look at costs for operations, like how you change ventilation filters. Is it centralized or distributed? Can have an impact of $100,000 a year on their operational costs. And so raising those is really important. The second thing I'd say, and especially say to Americans, because once you get on board with something, you're so great. It goes like gangbusters. A strikingly large amount of housing is pretty much the same building, 2 or 3 building forms over and over and over and over. And we know that the real key to cost savings is repetition and mass manufacture. And if somehow you can work with the federal government and state governments to create, let's say, 3 models, a double loaded corridor, a terrace style building, and something else that can happen again and again, whether it's panelized or modular, isn't really matter. It's that you can do the same building with the same windows and the same ventilation systems again and again on different sites. We know that's where the real cost savings come. If both the German and Chinese manufacturers have shown us, is that's where they get real savings in affordable housing. It's just by doing the same building 2, 3, 4 times in a row. You can still change the cladding. It doesn't have to be ugly. It doesn't have to be 12 on a lot like is done in some Chinese developments. But if we can get to that, it's probably the biggest cost lever we have. Anyway, really thank you for this. It's been a great presentation and I've enjoyed listening.
Thank you, Monty. Fred, you put your hand up. You want to?
I did. I can.
Hello.
Bomee and Yuan, thank you so much for this presentation. I hope my organization, the Metropolis CDC in Poverty Island, that's what our nickname is, will be able to reach out to you and we can work together to do some things down here. I want to bring to the attention of the people gathered here the website that I put in the chat, preserverosewood.org. Some of you are probably familiar that Austin, Texas has the oldest public housing in America. By that, I mean the oldest USHA, the oldest housing by the United States Housing Authority. Of course, New York has older public housing, but not fully 100% federally subsidized housing created by the USHA. Rosewood Courts is the nation's first housing project built for African Americans. In 2016, I wrote a white paper basically putting forward a plan to upgrade it, to interfit it to Passive House. And HUD right now is in the middle of the Section 106 process for this. And my organization, Montopolis CDC, as well as Preserve Rosewood, is trying to push Passive House renovation for this housing project. So one contribution I want to make to this conversation is a discussion about historic preservation as a tool to fight gentrification of low-income communities of color, okay? Passive House can also work in that space as well, as the experience in New York shows. So thanks again for your wonderful presentation. Down here in Texas, you can probably imagine it's the Wild West. If we had some of the tools that you all have up there, our lives would be a lot easier. But if you ever, want to find out how bad it can get, come on down here. Thanks again.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you for your comments. And yeah, I think I'll throw it to you, Ann and Bomee, but the idea of retrofitting is so important. And particularly in marginalized communities, underserved communities that can often be, fence line communities for highways, industrial production, and the benefits of housing around that. Thoughts on that, and also as well as bringing back to the community discussion and broadening the discussion, where we have places like Ithaca, and it's just going to increase in tempo with time, where people are rushing towards electrification. How do we get in front of it? How do we make sure these conversations are happening?
Yeah, I mean, Fred, thank you for those comments. I mean, I would love to see the public housing authorities have a little birds of a feather group where folks get together and talk about how to make passive house retrofits happen. New York has one pilot project. New York City Housing Authority has one pilot project that's slated to be passive house. It's actually out for procurement right now, I think. And then, and the last thing that I did before leaving New York City Housing Authority in April of this past year is I ran the electrification of heat and hot water RFP, which, it tells you a little bit about the kinds of compromises that you have to make when you're working in government, because obviously I would love to have had all of those be comprehensive projects to passive house that, but that's not, what we got to do as the project, right? What we had the resources and had the ability to do was a heat and hot water electrification separate from addressing the building envelope. And I say that just to point out that, we also, I think it's important to just recognize moments when we have to make forward progress and not, to quote the aphorism, I guess, not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? And so certainly we want to anticipate, how do we get from point A to B if we're not able to do that in one fell swoop? But even so, I think that we just want to make sure that the messaging that we put out there is really about alignment and climate justice and speed, right? Speed being always there as one of the legs of the three. And I think that in terms of the preservation of affordable housing and preservation of public housing, I know that not all communities have made the kind of commitment to public housing that New York has made over the years, right? New York is pretty much the last traditional public housing authority standing that holds traditional Section 9 public housing at scale. For me, it's important because of exactly what you were talking about, because it makes that tenure of low-income communities in these areas that are getting more expensive, it makes that tenure permanent. And it's important to recall, I think that's the aspect that is important. It's the permanence of the tenure that's important. It's not necessarily the form of ownership. It's not necessarily the fact that it's owned by a public housing authority that's important. It's that permanency of tenure. And if we can do that partly by, investing in those buildings in ways that extends the life of the building and thereby expands the opportunity for that permanent tenure, then that's another argument that we should be making to the housing advocacy community.
We're going to disagree about that one, but I hear you. That's
Oh,
an argument for RAD, and for the blueprint. And, as a public housing historian, I've got a book coming out about this. Most people don't know about the USHA. There's never a book written about the United States Housing Authority and Nathan Strauss, its first leader. Okay. There's stuff out there about Catherine Bauer, an iconic planner who was one of the founding mothers of the field of urban planning. Okay. But, what I'm hearing from you is radically different from the way it's done in Europe. Okay. And I think we need to be honest about that. I put some of that in the chat. Passive house scaled in Europe with social housing.
Yep.
The reason it did is because most municipalities in Europe own a significant percentage of such housing, and there's a much higher degree of municipal land ownership. Okay. You either must confront this beast of the market being anti-poverty policy and literally transferring money that was going to properly maintain that housing and giving it to rich, politically connected developers instead. You don't call that anti-poverty policy. That's something else. So the trickle down has got to stop, and you have to draw the line in the sand somewhere. That's how we get phrases like net zero, okay, which Greta Thunberg just called blah, 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 okay? So, we have to be candid about that. And, Ken, you'll be seeing a presentation for me at the conference in Boston about this. I'm working up something for everybody.
Wonderful. Great. And I look forward to, we'll be in touch. Let us know about when your book is coming.
Yeah, I think we can be candid about these things. And I think we can also, just also confront the reality that we have to do the work that we have to do today with the tools that we have today, while still fighting for, different paradigms.
Right. Frankly. Yeah, absolutely. Well put, everyone. And I think that's a good place to stop. I personally could talk about this all the rest of the day. It's absolutely fascinating. I think the report is very timely in terms of what we see happening and the action hopefully coming out of COP26, such as it is. And there's just huge opportunities. And to the extent that this report is a great tool for everyone to open up those conversations and make electrification benefits for everyone is hugely important. So I want to thank Bomee and Yuan for presenting here today, and for everyone for joining in contributions, and look forward to continuing the conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.